The snow fell in slow, heavy sheets on the morning Bastogne was cut off, a white curtain that swallowed the roads, the forests, and the last thin lines of retreat. Before dawn on 20 December 1944, the ring of German forces finally closed around the crossroads town, sealing inside it the 101st Airborne Division, elements of the 10th Armored Division, scattered infantry from the shattered 28th Division, and the two artillery battalions that would become its iron shield, the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion and the 420th Armored Field Artillery Battalion. In the dim light, their gun crews stood beside their M2A1 105mm howitzers, breath turning to vapor that drifted upward like ghosts. Snow clung to the barrels, the trails, even the crates of ammunition stacked under tarps that were already stiffening with frost. The cold, negative 18 degrees Celsius and falling, was an enemy as real as the one massing in the woods. The last convoy from New Chateau had barely cleared the southern road before reports came in from patrols. The Germans were everywhere. Panzer Lehr from the east, 26th Volksgrenadier from the north, 2nd Panzer Division probing from the northeast. Every road out of Bastogne had either been cut or was under fire. By 9:30, radio messages from 8th Corps confirmed the worst. Bastogne is now encircled. Inside the perimeter, Lieutenant Colonel John Cooper, commanding the 463rd PFAB, walked the gun line near the village of Hemroll, boots crunching in the frozen ruts. His men had been unloading ammunition through the night, stacking shells in pits dug into the hard ground, then covering them with branches and snow to hide them from Luftwaffe reconnaissance. "We hold here," Cooper told his battery officers, though the distant rumble of engines in the woods hinted at the storm that was coming. "If the infantry bends, our guns don't. We are the wall." The first calls for fire came in before noon. North of Foy, German infantry from the 26th Volksgrenadier were pushing toward a blocking position held by 502nd PIR. Cooper's men went to work. The howitzers barked in clean, sharp blasts that shattered the stillness of the forest, each recoil slamming the trails deeper into frozen soil. Powder smoke drifted in the cold air, mixing with the smell of pine and diesel fuel. Fire missions came one after another. Battery A, fire for effect, and the 463rd's guns answered every one. Tree bursts exploded above the advancing Germans, raining splinters and iron. The attack stalled. On the southern approach near Marvy, the 420th Armored Field Artillery Battalion, the Tankers Artillery, set up their own line of 105s in orchards, farmyards, and behind hedgerows. Their howitzers were mounted on half-tracks, nimble enough to reposition as the front shifted. Throughout the morning, they fired to support the 10th Armored's teams holding Marvy against probing elements of Panzer Lehr. The German assault guns pushed forward cautiously, headlights off, engines rumbling like distant thunder. Each time they gathered for an attack, the 420th's forward observers called in coordinates, and the battalion unleashed barrages that crashed into the tree lines, ripping apart infantry concentrations and forcing armor to scatter. By mid-afternoon, the Germans realized something unusual. Bastogne's artillery was firing harder, faster, and more precisely than expected for a force supposedly retreating. What they did not know, what they could not know, was that Cooper's 463rd PFAB was one of the best-trained airborne artillery units in the U.S. Army, veterans of the Mediterranean, tough enough to fight even while surrounded. As snow thickened into a blizzard, infantry platoons rotated back through the gun pits, carrying messages, observing fire, reporting enemy movements. Many of the radios had frozen or shorted from moisture, so runners braved German machine gun fire to bring targeting grids scribbled in pencil on scraps of map. At 1600, German armor was reported massing along the Noville Road. The 463rd shifted fire, laying down a curtain of high-explosive shells that rumbled across the forest like a rolling wave. The ground trembled, trees snapped at their base, falling in slow arcs. German tanks, unable to see through the storm of explosions, withdrew into the woods. "That's twice we saved the line today," a sergeant muttered as he wiped snow from the breach, steam rising where his hands touched cold steel. "Let's hope we have enough ammo to save it tomorrow." But ammunition was their greatest fear. Trucks that should have been carrying fresh 105mm rounds were now miles away, blocked, destroyed, or turned back by the encirclement. Every shell fired had to count. Every illumination round was debated. Smoke missions were nearly prohibited, and high-explosive shells were rationed like gold. "We fire until we cannot," Cooper told his officers that night, "and then we hold the guns and pray the tanks don't find us." As darkness fell across Bastogne, the sky flickered with distant fire. Burning farmhouses, artillery flashes, tracer arcs sweeping through snow-choked woods. The howitzers stood black and silent for the moment, their barrels steaming faintly, their crews huddled in foxholes or barns, drinking coffee that froze in their cups if they set it down too long. In the town square, Brigadier General McAuliffe studied the perimeter map by lantern light and said quietly, "The artillery will decide whether we stay here or not." He was right. The ring had closed. The siege had begun. And the 105mm guns of the 463rd and 420th were the only reason Bastogne stood at sundown on 20 December 1944. Dawn on 21 December broke with a hard, metallic cold that seeped into every seam of the gun pits, turning canvas stiff as wood and freezing condensation on the 105mm shells into a thin white crust. The men of the 463rd PFAB and 420th AFAB had slept in shifts, if they slept at all, curled beside their howitzers like guard dogs beside their masters. Snow muffled every sound except the distant crack of Mauser rifles and the low, throaty rumble of engines somewhere in the woods. It was the second day of encirclement, and already Bastogne felt like an island sinking beneath a tide of German steel. At 07:10, the first fire mission slammed into the silence. German infantry from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division had breached the outposts north of Foy. Forward observers from 502nd PIR radioed coordinates through static-filled lines. "Enemy massing in the tree line. Request immediate suppressive fire." Battery B of the 463rd reacted instantly. Breaches clanged open. Powder bags slid in with practiced speed, and shells were heaved into place despite the ice that made every movement feel slow and clumsy. The first volley cracked the air in a perfect ripple, a rolling blast that echoed across the frozen fields. The tree line erupted in flashes of orange as rounds detonated above the Germans, showering them with iron fragments and shattered pine. Within minutes, the Volksgrenadiers scattered, stumbling back into the woods. "That's how we keep them off the paratroopers," Lieutenant Harris muttered as he marked corrections on his fire table with a pencil dull from the cold. But the Germans kept coming. By mid-morning, Panzer Lehr pushed against the southern sector, Marvy, Warden, and the approach to the Neufchâteau Road. The 420th AFAB, firing from orchards south of Bastogne, unleashed a coordinated barrage that walked across the fields in measured lines, each explosion lifting plumes of snow and dirt skyward. Their armored half-track mounted howitzers repositioned constantly to avoid counter-battery fire, engines sputtering in the cold, exhausts coughing bursts of white as they roared from hedgerow to hedgerow. A forward observer near Marvy shouted into the radio, "Lehr infantry in the open, tanks forming up behind them." The 420th responded with time-fused HE, detonating mid-air over the advancing wedge of troops. The German line shattered like glass. But it was costly. The 420th was burning ammunition faster than any planner had ever intended. Shell crates dwindled. Powder bags were counted like food rations. Every commander knew the awful truth. No resupply was coming. That afternoon, clouds thickened and snow fell harder. Radios crackled. Interference worsened. At times, observers had to abandon their sets and send runners, boys no older than 19 sprinting through snowdrifts, while Panzer Lehr's guns probed for the artillery positions.
One runner reached Battery C of the 463rd, drenched in sweat despite the cold, gasping, "They're hitting Noville again! Attack forming on the right flank!" The guns pivoted. New deflection. New quadrant. Fire! The sky above Noville turned into a throbbing dome of concussions as the 463rd hammered the village outskirts, slowing the advance of elements of the 2nd Panzer Division. A paratrooper who later escaped Noville described the fire as the earth shaking beneath our feet, like the guns were holding the world together. On 22 December, German artillery returned the favor. At noon, a salvo of 105 and 150 mm shells came crashing into the artillery zone west of Hemrul. Shrapnel tore through snowbanks, wagons, and the branches camouflaging the guns. Several shells landed so close that one howitzer was flipped onto its side, wheels cracked, shield twisted. Miraculously, its crew survived. They righted the weapon with help from a neighboring battery, cursing and laughing through teeth chattering with shock. They were surrounded, freezing, outnumbered and low on ammunition, but they refused to leave a gun unusable. That afternoon brought an unexpected development. Under a white flag, 2 German officers approached Bastogne's lines and delivered the now infamous surrender demand. Brigadier General McAuliffe's "nuts" reply spread through the trenches and gun pits like wildfire. For the artillerymen, it meant, "We are fighting to the last round," and the rounds were running out. On the night of 22-23 December, both battalions rationed shells brutally. No harassing fire, no speculative fire, only confirmed enemy concentrations or desperate defensive barrages. Some fire missions were executed with reduced charges to conserve powder. Others reused brass casings hurriedly cleaned with rags stiffened by frost. By dawn on 23 December, word reached the 463rd that 2 batteries had fewer than 40 shells remaining each. Cooper gathered his officers in a snow-covered barn and spoke quietly, "If the line breaks, we fire until the barrels melt." No one doubted he meant it. At 10 a.m., another wave of Volksgrenadiers surged toward Foy. The 463rd fired their last full volley of the day, a devastating, perfectly aligned barrage that stopped the assault in its tracks. Paratroopers radioed back a message that warmed every frozen gun pit. "Your steel is saving us. Keep firing." But the guns could not fire much longer. Bastogne was starving for artillery ammunition. The men looked to the sky, hoping for a miracle, and on 23 December, for the first time in nearly a week, the sky began to clear.
Christmas Eve dawned not with warmth or mercy, but with a cold so sharp it felt like it could carve through bone. At -20 degrees Celsius, even breath crystallized in the air, drifting like smoke through the skeletal forests around Bastogne. But the cold was nothing compared to what the Germans unleashed that morning. Across the entire perimeter, Marvy, Neffy, Mont Saint-Étienne, and the ridges north of Foy, enemy forces surged forward in a massive, coordinated assault. It was the most violent day of the siege, and the day when the 105mm howitzers of the 463rd PFAB and 420th AFAB turned Bastogne into a fortress of fire. At 0730, forward observers from the 501st PIR spotted Panzer Lehr infantry forming up near Mont Saint-Étienne. The radio crackled out a grid coordinate. Battery A of the 463rd fired first, 4 rounds, then 8, then a full fire for effect that flattened the German staging area in less than 2 minutes. Snow and dirt erupted into the air in great geysers, and survivors fled into the woods, stunned by the violence of the barrage. But that was just the beginning. At 9:15, elements of the 2nd Panzer Division advanced from the northeast, pushing toward the road junction near Neffy. Their armored spearhead, Panzer IVs and a few Panthers rumbled through the forest trails, their engines growling beneath layers of frost. Paratroopers from 506th PIR radioed desperately for artillery. "Tanks at 300 meters, infantry behind them, fire mission, danger close." The 463rd shifted its guns with incredible precision. Snow had frozen
frozen the wheels and trails, turning every adjustment into a struggle, but the crews fought the metal into obedience. Within minutes, 105mm rounds screamed overhead and burst along the tree line, smashing the German infantry escort and blinding the tanks with smoke and debris. Several panzers halted, unsure if they were driving into an anti-tank kill zone. The paratroopers seized the moment, knocking out the lead tank with a bazooka shot. "Your fire broke them," came the shouted message from the line. Meanwhile, on the southern front, Marvy faced its worst attack of the siege. Panzer Lehr regrouped and hurled fresh infantry and armor against the 10th Armored's thin defensive screen. The 420th AFAB, positioned in orchards and fields, now buried in snow, answered with a rolling barrage so intense that even veteran artillerymen later admitted they had never fired so fast, so continuously, or with such desperation. Their half-track mounted howitzers bucked and roared, exhaust pipes spitting ice and smoke as crews slammed shell after shell into the breaches. "Repeat! Repeat! Keep firing!" the FO shouted over the radio. German infantry were forced to crawl behind the holes of their tanks to avoid the bursts. One officer from Panzer Lehr later described the barrage as like being inside a steel hailstorm. But the worst moment came just after noon. At 12:40, a large German force, Volksgrenadier supported by tanks, punched through a wooded ravine near the village of Hemrul. From their concealed trenches, the paratroopers of 501st PIR watched in alarm as more than 100 German soldiers began pouring toward the thinly held line. They radioed the coordinates, but interference made the transmission nearly unreadable. When the message finally reached the 463rd, it came through garbled. "Enemy, many, close." Lieutenant Colonel Cooper didn't hesitate. "We'll walk the fire right to them," he ordered. "Danger close authorized. Put steel in the trees." The guns roared. High explosive shells burst above the ravine, turning the forest into a tornado of splinters and shrapnel. The Germans were shredded before they knew what hit them. Survivors dropped their weapons and fled. A paratrooper later told an interviewer, "The artillery saved us. We would have been wiped out in 5 minutes." But the Germans were relentless. At 1400 hours, another push threatened the perimeter near Champs. The 502nd PIR was nearly overwhelmed when German troops infiltrated through the tree line. The artillery fired again, so close that some bursts landed less than 150 meters from friendly positions. "Lift 100, left 50, the FO screamed, adjusting fire with incredible precision. All afternoon, the sky above Bastogne flashed with explosions, flickering like a storm of fire trapped beneath the clouds. Some guns overheated. Barrels hissed when snow touched them. Breech blocks scorched gloves. Powder fumes hung in the air like fog. At one point, Battery C of the 420th had to extinguish a small fire that ignited ammunition crates after a shell casing shattered and sprayed sparks. Through it all, the crews kept firing. Nobody spoke of fatigue. Nobody asked how many shells were left. They only shot, loaded, and shot again. By sunset, the howitzers had fired more than 2,000 rounds in a single day, more than some battalions fired in an entire week during Normandy. German radio intercepts later revealed that the attackers had been convinced Bastogne held far more artillery than it actually did. One message read, "Enemy fire is constant and devastating. Their artillery must be superior in number." But the truth was that just 2 battalions, 463rd and 420th, had created that illusion. As darkness settled over the snow-covered fields, the attack slowed. The Germans pulled back to regroup, leaving behind bodies, burned-out vehicles, and smoking craters. Bastogne still stood, and it stood because of the storm of steel the artillerymen had unleashed, an endless wall of fire that turned Christmas Eve into one of the most violent days of the entire Battle of the Bulge.
Christmas morning in Bastogne did not arrive with hymns or warmth. It came with a low, distant rumble, German artillery preparing to strike again. The temperature hovered near -20 degrees Celsius, breath freezing instantly, frost forming on eyebrows and rifle barrels. Snow reflected the pale light of dawn, giving the battlefield a ghostly glow. For the exhausted men of the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion and the 420th Armored Field Artillery Battalion, Christmas was not a day of rest. It was the day the Germans would try to break them.
At 0630, the first shells came in, 150mm naval warfare rockets, shrieking overhead and exploding in geysers of black smoke. The ground shook. Snow cascaded from branches. A direct hit smashed into the edge of a gun pit belonging to Battery B of the 463rd, burying 2 men and stunning the rest. They clawed through snow and splintered logs to dig out the trapped crewmen, both miraculously alive. Before anyone could catch their breath, the radios crackled. Marvy under heavy attack. Panzer Lehr is advancing. Request immediate fire mission. Teams from the 420th AFAB swung into action. Their half-track mounted 105mm howitzers roared, sending shells arcing over the treetops. Forward observers from the 10th Armored Division watched the rounds land among the advancing German infantry, tearing gaps in their ranks. But the enemy kept coming. Panzer IVs pushed through the smoke, machine guns chattering as they probed the defenses. The paratroopers in Marvy were nearly overrun. The artillery fired again, high-angle shots that burst above the German assault teams. "Perfect! Walk it left! Walk it left!" the FO shouted as the blasts tore through the snow-covered hedgerows. One German survivor later described the barrage as like being inside a steel cage filled with explosions. Across the northern line, near the village of Champs, the 502nd PIR faced an even more desperate assault. 26th Volksgrenadier Division troops infiltrated through the woods, using the trunks of the pines for cover. Paratroopers fought from foxholes that were little more than frozen pits, their garans stiff from cold, their boots rigid with ice. At 0910, the FO sent an urgent coordinate update. "They're in the trees, danger close, fire immediately." The 463rd answered with precision that bordered on madness. At just 150 to 180 meters from friendly positions, their 105mm shells detonated above the tree line, showering shrapnel through the advancing Volksgrenadiers. Men in Champs could feel the concussions in their chests. Snow erupted in pillars, trees splintered. Entire squads of German infantry vanished in bursts of fire and steel. "You saved our skins," a 502nd trooper later said. "Without that artillery, Champs would have fallen in 10 minutes." By midday, both battalions were nearing exhaustion. The crews were numb, some with early frostbite, hands cracked and bleeding from loading shell after shell in the freezing air. Meals consisted of frozen K rations gnawed between missions. Coffee froze in tin cups. But the Germans were relentless. At 1300 hours, word came from the southeast. Nefra was under attack by elements of the 2nd Panzer Division. Tanks punched through the outer defenses, their silhouettes looming through the drifting snow. Artillery observers struggled to maintain visibility, relying on sound, engine echoes, tracks grinding ice to adjust fire. Twice, radios froze stiff, and men had to warm them under their coats before transmitting again. The 463rd unleashed another barrage, firing at maximum charge, shells whining overhead before slamming into the German armor columns. A Panzer IV took a direct hit to its track and spun to a halt. Another was disabled when a tree, split by a 105mm burst, fell across its engine deck. "You can break tanks with steel or trees, doesn't matter to me," a gunner muttered as he rammed another shell home. But ammunition was becoming a nightmare. Each battery had fewer than 30 to 40 rounds left. Powder bags were rationed. Fuses were reused. Some shells weren't even wiped clean of ice before being loaded. Every man knew the cold truth. If the Germans launched one more coordinated assault, they might break the American line simply because the artillery would be unable to stop them. Afternoon brought no relief. The Germans attacked Foy, attempting to break through toward Bastogne center. The 463rd fired again, so close that the FO shouted corrections through gunfire. The rounds landed perfectly, tearing apart the assault and scattering survivors into the woods. At 1700 hours, the sun began to set, turning the snowfields pink. German dead lay scattered across the ravines and tree lines. Burned-out tanks smoldered. Bastogne was still holding, but barely. In the gathering darkness, a rumble echoed from the distance, more German armor moving into position for a night attack. The artillery crews stood ready, though their ammo crates were nearly empty. They were living hour to hour, shell to shell. When night finally swallowed the battlefield, the guns fell silent, not out of victory, but because nearly every shell had been fired. The men sat beside their howitzers in the freezing dark, exhausted, shivering, listening for engines in the night. Christmas in Bastogne had been fought with fire, steel, and desperation. And though the day had ended without a breakthrough, the Americans knew the truth. If ammunition didn't arrive soon, Bastogne would fall.
The morning of 26 December 1944 began in a silence so absolute it felt unnatural. No artillery, no tank engines, no Volksgrenadiers shouting from the woods, just the creak of frozen branches and the faint hiss of wind sweeping across the snow. The men of the 463rd PFAB and 420th AFAB emerged from their dugouts tired, half-frozen, and nearly out of ammunition. Some batteries had fewer than a dozen 105mm shells left, others had none at all. And still, the Germans were out there. Panzer Lehr, 26th Volksgrenadier, the armored spearheads of 2nd Panzer Division, waiting for the moment Bastogne's guns fell silent for good. At 0840, that moment nearly arrived. A large German force, probing for weaknesses south of Bastogne, near Assenois, advanced through the fog. Forward observers of the 327th Glider Infantry called frantically for fire support. Battery A of the 420th AFAB scrambled to respond. Men dug through snow-covered crates, counting what little remained. A handful of HE rounds, several smoke shells, and some leftover charge increments. "We'll fire what we have," Captain Evans told his crew. "Then we hold the line with rifles." The first 4 rounds landed perfectly, tight grouping, right on target. The Germans halted, confused by artillery that should not have existed. But the next salvo could not follow. The gun was empty. At 0910, as if the enemy sensed the weakness, Panzer Lehr launched another infantry assault toward Marvy. The FO pleaded for immediate fire. "They're breaking through, enemy in strength, if we don't stop them now." The 463rd had only scraps of ammunition left, but Lieutenant Colonel Cooper ordered a final barrage. Battery C loaded every remaining high-explosive round, 6 shells total, and fired them in rapid succession. The explosions tore through the German ranks, buying precious minutes for the paratroopers to hold their ground. Then the guns fell silent. For the first time in the battle, Bastogne had almost no artillery left. And that was when a sound rolled across the snow from the south, a deep, rhythmic thunder that grew louder and louder until men stood up from their foxholes, stunned. Engines, many of them, Sherman engines, coming fast. At 1645, scouts of the 4th Armored Division broke through German lines near Assenois, racing toward the Bastogne perimeter. At 1650, the lead tank, a Sherman from Company C 37th Tank Battalion, rolled into the American lines, its crew waving from the turret. The paratroopers cheered so loudly that men miles away later swore they heard it. Bastogne was relieved, the siege was broken, but the fight was not over. On 27 December, the Germans, enraged by the breakthrough, launched counterattacks around Champs, Neffe, and the Marvy sector. Now partially resupplied through the newly opened corridor, the 463rd and 420th rushed to re-establish firing positions. Fresh ammunition arrived, small amounts, but enough to fight. And fight they did. That afternoon, a battle group of 2nd Panzer Division attempted to cut the corridor by pushing toward the Assenois road. The 420th responded first. Their howitzers, now warm, fueled, and loaded, sent a curtain of HE across the German advance. Panthers tried to maneuver, but the terrain forced them into narrow approaches where American artillery could bracket them.
When the 463rd joined in, their rounds fell in perfect synchronicity, smashing the infantry escorts and forcing the tanks to withdraw. A Panther took a near hit and spun sideways, tracks biting into the frozen ground before the crew bailed out. "They're pulling back," the FO shouted, and then, "Artillery! Nice shooting! Bastards are running!" Throughout the night, small probes continued along the perimeter, but the German offensive had lost its momentum. Bastogne, once an isolated island, was now the tip of the spear as Patton's Third Army surged north. For the artillerymen, the relief brought more than ammunition. It brought the first real warmth in days. Fires were allowed, stoves lit, hot coffee brewed. Men thawed their gloves and boots, flexing fingers that had gone numb during the freezing nights of the siege. But even in the warmth, the cost of the battle became clear. Gun pits were littered with spent brass, shattered crates, twisted camouflage nets, and the blackened scars of German counter-battery hits. Several howitzers were destroyed. Others were scarred by shrapnel. Many men were wounded. Frostbite, concussion, shrapnel, burns from overheated breeches. But they had held. They had done what no one thought possible. 2 artillery battalions had stopped elements of 3 German divisions, Panzer Lehr, 26th Volksgrenadier, and 2nd Panzer Division, long enough for Patton to break the siege. Over the next days, as the weather warmed slightly and reinforcements flowed in, the artillerymen finally had time to reflect. Sergeant Will Warren of the 463rd wrote in his journal, "I never thought a few 105s could hold back panzers, but they did. I guess it's not the gun, it's the men behind it." Officers of the 101st Airborne later credited the artillery with saving the division from annihilation. Brigadier General McAuliffe himself wrote, "Without the fire of the 463rd and 420th, Bastogne could not have stood." On the morning of 28 December, a thin sun rose over the battered town. Smoke drifted from chimneys. Shermans idled along the roads. Paratroopers cleaned rifles. Artillery crews wiped frost from the barrels of their howitzers. The siege was over. Bastogne lived. And it lived because its iron shield, the 105mm guns of the 463rd and 420th, had not broken. Even when surrounded, even when frozen, even when out of ammunition, they had fired until help arrived. And that made all the difference.